For medieval Swiss peasants, death wasn't just an end. It was always present. 1 in 2 children never saw their 5th birthday. Women faced childbirth like warriors going to battle. Men risked famine, plague, or a simple infected wound. Yet they danced when they could, sang when they couldn't, and carved joy from fleeting moments. As Helvetia, I've watched centuries of such resilient souls pass through my valleys. Tonight, let me tell you their quiet stories of endurance, how ordinary people found light in history's darkest corners. The air in a medieval Swiss home carried layers of scent, wood smoke trapped in woolen tunics, the earthy warmth of cattle breathing nearby, sour milk turning to cheese in the rafters. There were no separate rooms as we know them now. Families lived in a single shared space with their livestock, the animals providing extra warmth during winter months. The walls stood only shoulder high, leaving the upper portion open to allow smoke from the central hearth to rise into the roof space. This meant smells and sounds traveled freely between neighboring houses after dark. When night settled over the village, you'd hear the constant rustle of cows shifting in their stalls, their hooves shuffling against the packed earth floor. Children coughed in the loft overhead, where most families slept together on sacks stuffed with straw. Beneath them, chickens roosted on rafters, their droppings sometimes falling past hanging strips of curing meat. The floor consisted of hard-packed dirt, occasionally covered with fresh rushes, that gradually became matted with food scraps and fish bones over time. In wealthier homes, herbs might be strewn among the rushes to mask odors, but most peasants simply lived with the gradual accumulation of daily life. Windows appeared only as wooden shutters that stayed closed during cold months, trapping dampness inside. On winter mornings, frosted patterns decorated the interior walls, where family members' breath had condensed overnight. The single doorway rarely had a proper door, just a thick woolen hanging that blew aside with each entrance or exit. Yet this constant closeness created its own form of comfort. People grew accustomed to the press of warm bodies around the hearth, the predictable rhythms of shared tasks, the way sound carried through the open roof beams from one household to the next. At the heart of every home stood the hearth, not just for cooking, but as the living center of domestic life. Here, routines unfolded in patterns unchanged for generations. Women spun wool, while simultaneously stirring pots of soup, their fingers moving automatically through familiar motions. Children played on the floor nearby, their games weaving around adult work. Tools hung within easy reach: wooden spoons, iron cookware, the precious salt box secured to a rafter to keep its contents dry. At night, the fire's embers glowed beneath hanging bundles of herbs, filling the dark with faint medicinal scents as the family curled together under their shared woolen blanket. The craftsmanship of these homes reflected practical ingenuity. Beams bore the marks of broadaxes that had shaped them, their surfaces darkened by decades of smoke. Joints connected without nails, fitting together through careful carving. Despite the simplicity of construction, these houses sheltered families through generations of alpine winters. The walls might not have been thick, but they stood firm against mountain winds, while the open roof design prevented smoke from becoming unbearable. Every element served multiple purposes. The same rafters that supported the roof also stored food. The hearth that cooked meals also heated the room. The livestock that provided milk and cheese also warmed the space with their body heat, Life in such close quarters required unspoken rules. Everyone understood which corner belonged to which activity, when to make space for others, how to move through the tight quarters without disruption. Privacy didn't exist as modern people know it, but the lack of separation fostered a constant awareness of others' needs. Children grew up hearing every conversation, witnessing every task, absorbing the rhythms of adult labor through daily observation. The line between work and home life blurred completely, with spinning, sewing, tool mending, and food preparation all happening simultaneously in the shared space. At mealtimes, families gathered around the hearth on simple stools, sharing from a common bowl or trencher. When someone fell ill, their fevered breathing became part of the household's nightly sounds. When a baby was born, neighbors would hear its first cries through the open roof beams. Death, too, happened in this communal space, with the dying surrounded by family, animals, and the familiar sense of home. The house absorbed all these moments into its walls and floorboards, the wood growing darker with each passing year from smoke, touch, and the accumulation of life lived in close quarters. Through summer and winter droughts, and storms, harvests, and lean years, the single-room home remained the constant stage for human lives. Generations passed through these spaces, learning the same sounds, the same smells, the same ways of moving through the dim light. The pressing together of bodies in cold months, the spreading out in summer, the unchanging position of the hearth, where grandmother told stories to grandchildren 60 years apart, each repetition binding the community tighter to its place in the valley. Such homes demanded little from the world beyond their walls, yet provided everything essential: shelter, warmth, and the company of familiar voices. They smelled of animals, wool, smoke, and the particular odor of one's own family, a scent so ingrained it went unnoticed, except in rare moments of absence. At night, when the fire burned low and breath slowed into sleep, the cracks between roof beams might show a handful of stars or driving snow, but inside the accumulated heat of bodies and beasts kept the cold at bay. Morning light through cracks in the shutters would reveal frost tracing fern-like patterns across walls, fingerprints on wooden surfaces, crumbs from last night's meal trodden into the floor, each detail marking another day in the perpetual cycle of rural life. The house stood as both protector and witness its walls, absorbing laughter arguments, lullabies, secrets, none forgotten, merely layered like the soot on its rafters, waiting to be uncovered by memory's quiet examination. Through all seasons, sickness plenty and scarcity, these timber structures framed the parameters of existence for Swiss peasants. Simple in conception, yet profound in endurance, their walls contained entire worlds, humming with the quiet music of daily survival. Women spun wool men, carved wood children chased chickens through the rushes, according to rhythms established centuries before them, rhythms that would continue long after their voices had faded from the smoke-darkened beams. Few personal possessions filled these spaces, yet each home contained lifetimes of accumulated knowledge: how to mend a wool cap, where to find the sweetest berries, which corner stayed warmest in deep winter. Such wisdom passed endlessly among generations, wrapped in the scent of wood smoke and wet wool, the eternal perfume of medieval peasant life, an odor that clung to skin, clothing, hair, long after leaving the house's embrace. These dwellings lacked grandeur, yet perfected utility, every inch serving purpose harmony existing between human need and the materials at hand. The homes demanded little ceremony, bowed to no fashion, changed only as necessity dictated, yet they withstood centuries witnessing generations come and go, protecting their inhabitants from alpine storms, if not from life's other hardships. Their endurance formed a silent testament to the tenacity of those who depended on such simple shelters through Switzerland's long winters and fleeting summers. When villagers gathered to help raise a new house after fire or flood, each contribution of labor or material strengthened community bonds as surely as the woven branches between the beams. The resulting structure would shelter sons, daughters, grandchildren, each adding their stories to the walls, each becoming part of the home's living memory, its whispers mixing with the mountain wind through roof cracks to carry ordinary lives into legend. The hearth defined the rhythm of daily life in medieval Swiss homes. Day and night, it pulsed with activity, its flickering light illuminating tasks that changed with the seasons. Women moved through well-practiced routines, stirring pots suspended over the fire with one hand while spinning wool with the other. Children played nearby, their games weaving between work tasks, learning adult skills through observation. The hearth's warmth made it the natural gathering point, where cold fingers thawed and tired bodies rested after long days in the fields or forests. Essential tools occupied every available space around this central feature. Wooden spindles and distaffs hung from smoke-blackened rafters, ready for use when daylight faded. Iron cooking pots swung over the fire on adjustable chains, their surfaces darkened by years of use. A prized wooden salt box perched in a dry spot, its contents too valuable to leave unprotected. Nearby, simple utensils carved from local wood served multiple purposes. The same spoon might stir porridge in the morning and medicine at night. Little went unused or wasted in this carefully organized workspace. Evening transformed the hearth into a different kind of center. As the last meal finished cooking, embers glowed beneath bundles of drying herbs hung from the rafters. Chamomile for tea, mint for stomach ailments, thyme for winter coughs. The family's single shared blanket, woven from coarse wool, often rested near enough to benefit from the fading heat. This time brought quieter activities, mending torn clothing, repairing tools, or preparing flax for next day's spinning. The fire's dim glow created shadows that danced across faces as people shared news or sang familiar songs. Above this nightly scene, chickens roosted on sturdy beams, their soft clucking sometimes interrupted when someone added wood to the fire. Their droppings fell randomly through the rafters, sometimes landing near hanging sausages or drying herbs. No one minded much. The chickens provided eggs, meat when they stopped laying, and another source of warmth in winter. Their presence was simply part of home, like the scent of smoke in wool clothing or the sound of wind rattling the shutters. One corner of the house served as the textile workshop during long winter evenings. There stood the flax brake, a heavy wooden tool used to process flax fibers into linen. Women and older children would spend hours breaking the tough stems, then scraping them to release the soft inner fibers. The rhythmic cracking sound became as familiar as the fire's crackle, marking time on winter nights. Nearby, a spinning wheel might occupy pride of place in wealthier homes, though most families made do with simple drop spindles. Textile production never stopped. Every moment of sitting included spinning or mending. Every conversation happened over moving fingers. Sleeping arrangements reflected the practical nature of these homes. The family bed was usually a raised wooden platform filled with straw, sometimes partitioned by a simple curtain for privacy. In colder months, everyone slept together for warmth, bodies arranged like spoons to conserve heat. Fleas and lice were constant companions, though people combed their hair regularly with fine-toothed implements to manage the problem. Bedding consisted of the same wool garments worn during the day, sometimes supplemented by hide blankets in wealthier households. The notion of changing clothes for sleep would have seemed absurd when warmth mattered more than comfort. Morning began before dawn at the hearth's edge. Someone rose first to stir the embers and add kindling, blowing gently until flames took hold. The fire's rebirth started the household's daily cycle, water heating for porridge, tools gathered for the day's work, plans made in low voices. Children woke gradually to the familiar sounds and smells, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they pulled on cold clothing. Morning light filtering through shutters revealed the hearth's central position once more, now surrounded by activity instead of sleep. Throughout the changing seasons, the hearth remained the stable point in a peasant family's world. In summer, its flames burned lower as people spent more daylight hours outdoors. Autumn saw it surrounded by the season's harvest, apples drying on strings, nuts roasting in pans, squash baking in ashes. Winter demanded constant feeding as the household's sole source of warmth, its stone borders radiating heat to nearby bodies. Spring brought the yearly cleaning, when accumulated soot was scraped from the chimney and fresh rushes covered the floor. The house's layout maximized the hearth's benefits. Cooking pots hung at different heights to regulate temperature, higher for simmering, lower for rapid boiling. Nearby stones absorbed heat during the day, releasing it slowly through the night. Smoke curled upward through the open roof beams, curing hanging meats and cheeses while it escaped. Every placement served multiple purposes, from the onions stored near the chimney for drying, to the medicinal herbs kept far enough away to prevent scorching. Mealtimes naturally centered around this vital space. Families ate from shared bowls or trenchers, their hands serving as utensils for most foods. The hearth provided constant heat for cooking, but also held warm stones used to heat beds or warm, chilled hands. Its embers banked under nighttime ash would still be warm enough to stir back to life come morning, ensuring no wasted effort in restarting the fire. This careful conservation characterized all hearth activities. Why waste heat when the same flame could cook, warm, and dry simultaneously? Children learned life skills within arm's reach of the hearth. By age 5 or 6, they could turn roasting meat on a spit or stir porridge under supervision. Older children mastered bread baking, learning exactly how hot the hearthstones needed to be before sliding loaves onto them. Young girls practiced spinning with tiny distaffs, while their mothers worked with larger ones. Boys learned to repair tools or carve wooden implements while sitting at the fire's edge. All absorbed the rhythms of work inevitably tied to the hearth's needs, fetching wood, carrying water, grinding grain, tasks that filled the spaces between other chores. The household's health relied heavily on this central fire. Herbs drying overhead would become teas or poultices for winter ailments. Water boiled for cooking also sterilized simple medical instruments or cleaning cloths. Warm rocks, wrapped in cloth, soothed aching muscles after long days of labor. Even childbirth often occurred near the hearth, where warmth and boiling water were readily available. Its flames provided light for midnight nursing sessions or emergency treatments, casting long shadows on walls, as people moved around the sickbed. Special hearthstones held particular importance in family traditions. Some bore generations of marks, where hot pans had rested, their surfaces smoothed by decades of use. Others had been carefully selected over time for their ability to retain heat. These might be wrapped in rags and placed at the foot of a sick person's bed. One special flat stone likely served as the household's baking surface, its pores slowly filling with decades of oils and residues that prevented sticking. These unremarkable objects acquired deep personal significance through constant use and association with domestic life. Beyond practical functions, the hearth fostered community and storytelling. Neighbors visiting on winter evenings would gather around its warmth, sharing news and traditions. Older family members recounted tales from their youth or legends passed down through generations, the firelight adding drama to their telling. Music sometimes filled the smoky air, simple reed pipes, a handmade drum, or just voices carrying familiar melodies. Celebrations naturally centered here too, with special foods prepared and shared around the flickering light during festivals or weddings. The covenant between fire and family created bonds beyond blood. Households routinely shared hearth resources, borrowing embers to start a new fire, trading knowledge of herb uses, collectively caring for sick members. A home's central fire represented both physical survival and social connection, its maintenance a shared responsibility. Children sent to neighboring homes on errands might be asked to bring back some fire in a clay pot, both practical help and a symbol of interdependence. This network of glowing hearths connected scattered households into cohesive communities. Seasonal rhythms followed the hearth's changing demands. Summer saw less frequent fires as people cooked outdoors whenever possible, and nights stayed milder. Autumn meant preparing the hearth for heavy use, checking chimney stones, stocking fuel supplies, organizing cookware. Winter transformed it into an around-the-clock responsibility, with someone always awake to tend the flames during coldest nights. Spring cleaning brought the annual ritual of clearing ash and soot, readying the space for another year's cycle. These patterns repeated across generations, linking medieval Swiss families to predecessors who had kept similar fires burning in similar homes. The hearth's architecture evolved subtle efficiencies over time. Smoke shelves helped direct airflow while preventing downdrafts. Special niches held kindling at just the right distance from heat sources, close enough to dry, but not ignite prematurely. Cooking arrangements allowed multiple pots to hang at varying heights, optimizing limited cooking space. Areas closest to the fire developed distinct purposes. One side for baking, another for simmering, a third for keeping prepared foods warm. These small innovations accumulated through trial and error, each generation refining what they'd inherited. Fire's spiritual significance also centered on the hearth. Families might bury a newborn's umbilical cord beneath its stones for protection, or place protective herbs in the chimney against evil spirits. Certain festivals required special hearth fires, larger for solstices, smokier for purification rituals. Omens were read in flame patterns and ash formations, with particular attention paid to how new fires caught. The crossroads between practical necessity and folk belief became blurred here, where survival depended on respectful treatment of this dangerous but essential element. Comparing wealth between households often came down to hearth arrangements. Prosperous families might have proper chimneys, instead of open roofing, multiple cooking vessels, or specialized roasting equipment. Their fires burned brighter and longer, fed by ample fuel supplies. Poorer homes made do with simpler setups, cooking fewer dishes and enduring smokier conditions. Yet regardless of status, the hearth remained each family's pride. Clean swept, carefully tended, the heart of domestic life. Its condition reflected the household's well-being as clearly as any ledger. The passage of time measured itself in hearth rituals. Young brides learned to manage new household fires through careful instruction. Elderly grandparents spent increasing hours near its warmth as seasons passed. Children grew from observers to helpers to masters of the flame's many uses. Generations turned over like logs in the fire, each adding heat before making way for the next. Through plagues and droughts, harsh winters and fleeting summers, the hearth's glow persisted in Swiss valleys, tiny beacons of human resilience against the alpine night. The blackened iron pot hanging over the hearth never cooled completely. Day and night it simmered with whatever ingredients could be scavenged, its contents changing slightly with each mealtime. Before dawn, someone would add more water and barley to yesterday's remnants, creating a porridge that thickened slowly as morning light filtered through the shutters. Handfuls of wrinkled greens, foraged from the forest edge, or last season's dried herbs, seasoned the mix. This perpetual stew ensured no scrap of food went to waste, while providing constant nourishment for working bodies. Barley formed the backbone of most peasant diets. Roughly ground between simple millstones, it produced a coarse flour that made dense, chewy bread when baked on hearthstones. The dough fermented slowly in a wooden trough near the fire, its sour tang filling the single-room home. Baked loaves came out dark and hard, their crusts tough enough to require soaking in broth or weak ale before chewing. Such bread stayed edible for weeks, making it practical for field workers and travelers alike. Its durability led to unexpected uses, as makeshift plates called trenchers that absorbed meal juices before being eaten themselves, or even as improvised weapons when disputes turned violent during village gatherings. Smoke rising from the hearth served as a natural preservative for other staples. Wheels of cheese hardened in the rafters, their surfaces darkening as they aged. Goat milk cheeses predominated in mountainous areas, where cows struggled on steep pastures. Each household developed subtle variations in flavor based on their grazing lands, storage conditions, and family recipes passed through generations. Alongside the cheeses hung strings of autumn apples, sliced thin to dry in the warm air. These chewy fruit slices provided precious winter sweetness and could be softened in water or ground into flour when supplies ran low. Meat rarely appeared in peasant cooking, except during festivals or unexpected windfalls. A lucky snare might catch a hare while gathering firewood. An old hen no longer laying eggs could find her way into the pot, along with wild onions and turnips. On rare occasions, a village might collectively slaughter and divide a pig raised by the community. Most families reserved such precious protein for special occasions, stretching small portions through soups and stews. Bones didn't go to waste either, simmered repeatedly until they crumbled, their marrow adding richness to otherwise lean meals. Dairy products required careful handling in an era before refrigeration. Fresh milk soured quickly, especially in warmer months, so most was processed immediately into longer-lasting forms. Butter was churned in wooden containers, then pressed to remove moisture, and stored in brine. Hard cheeses could last through winter when properly cured and stored. Whey, the leftover liquid from cheese making, became the base for soups or drinks, rather than being discarded. Even spoiled milk found uses, mixed with herbs as a facial cleanser, or combined with ashes to make primitive soap. Seasonal shifts dramatically altered available ingredients. Spring brought tender greens and the first eggs from chickens, stimulated by longer days. Summer offered berries, mushrooms, and the labor-intensive harvest of grain crops. Autumn meant frantic preparations, smoking meats, drying fruits, fermenting cabbage into sauerkraut, anything that could preserve summer's bounty for winter. By deep winter, meals became monotonous rounds of porridge, hard bread, and whatever stored roots remained edible. Snow melted for drinking water when village wells froze solid. Honey provided the only sweetener for most peasants, gathered from wild hives at considerable risk. Beekeeping existed, but required specialized knowledge and equipment beyond most families' means. A lucky find of honeycomb became cause for celebration, its golden sweetness reserved for special occasions or medicinal uses. Maple syrup was unknown in medieval Switzerland, and imported sugar remained an unimaginable luxury. Even dried fruits counted as precious treats, often appearing only during religious festivals or weddings. Herbs and wild plants supplemented both nutrition and flavor. Women and children gathered nettles for soups, their sting disappearing when cooked, sorrel for its lemony tang, and countless other greens that modern palates might overlook. Knowledge of edible versus poisonous plants formed essential survival wisdom, passed from mother to daughter. Some villages maintained common herb gardens near the church, where everyone could harvest small amounts of thyme, sage, or other useful plants. These same herbs doubled as medieval medicine: chamomile for upset stomachs, mint for headaches, rosemary for improving memory. Cooking techniques maximized every calorie. Stone baking allowed bread preparation without wasting precious metal cookware. Roasting happened directly in hearth ashes for foods like onions or eggs. Soups and stews used minimal fuel by slow cooking over banked coals. Mechanical spits turned meat evenly before the fire, while requiring no constant attention. Even the heat differential within a single hearth was carefully managed. Hottest spots for boiling, cooler edges for simmering, and warm ashes for keeping prepared foods from cooling too quickly. Meal schedules followed agricultural rhythms. During planting or harvest seasons, workers might eat 4 smaller meals to sustain long hours in fields. Winter saw 2 main meals, with perhaps some porridge at bedtime to stave off cold. Breakfast was typically leftovers from the previous night, often eaten cold unless the hearth fire had been maintained through the night. The main meal came at midday, when light was strongest for working afterwards, followed by a lighter supper at dusk before sleep. Diet varied significantly by social class, even within peasant communities. A well-off farmer might enjoy fresh bread weekly, while poorer laborers made do with coarse barley gruel. Village craftsmen could sometimes barter their skills for better cuts of meat or dairy products. Landless laborers at the bottom of the social ladder survived largely on whatever their employers provided, often the most basic fare available. Yet all shared the same fundamental challenge of making limited ingredients last through unpredictable seasons. Nutritional deficiencies were common, despite peasant ingenuity. Winters particularly tested bodies, already weakened by constant labor. Scurvy from lack of fresh produce appeared each spring before new greens could be harvested. Children showed signs of rickets from insufficient sunlight and dietary variety. Tooth wear from gritty bread flour led to painful abscesses that could prove fatal without treatment. The very old and very young were most vulnerable when supplies ran short, their weaker constitutions succumbing to infections that others might survive. Religious observances structured food availability through fasting periods. Nearly half the medieval calendar involved some dietary restriction: no meat on Fridays, strict fasting during Lent, and numerous saints' days requiring abstinence. Fish was permitted during fasts, but remained scarce in mountain regions far from lakes or rivers. These religious requirements ironically improved peasant health at times by enforcing cycles of lighter eating amid generally scarce conditions. Festival days provided the opposite: rare occasions for indulgence that broke the year's monotony. Food preparation was women's domain, with skills learned through lifelong observation. From toddler age, girls watched their mothers judge dough consistency, test meat doneness, and adjust flavors through experience, rather than written recipes. By adolescence, they could manage basic cooking. By childbirth, they directed household food strategies. This unwritten culinary knowledge determined family survival through lean times, with particularly skilled cooks, sometimes earning village-wide reputations for their abilities. Storage methods demonstrated remarkable innovation within technological limits. Root cellars lined with straw kept vegetables from freezing in winter. Cheese soaked in brine lasted longer than dry-aged versions. Grains were stored in elevated containers to deter rodents. Some villages dug communal ice pits lined with insulating materials to preserve meats into warmer months. Every preservation technique aimed to extend edible supplies while minimizing spoilage, a constant battle against mold, insects, and hungry wildlife. Drinking water sources carried constant contamination risks near populated areas. Small beer or watered wine provided safer alternatives, their alcohol content low, but sufficient to kill some pathogens. Children drank buttermilk or whey when available. Herbal teas made from mint, chamomile, or other plants offered variety, while also serving medicinal purposes. True coffee and tea wouldn't reach Europe for centuries, leaving medieval Swiss with limited but locally sustainable beverage options. Food-related rituals marked life's milestones. Brides demonstrated cooking skills at weddings by preparing ceremonial dishes. New mothers received special broths to restore their strength. Funeral meals used whatever foods the bereaved family could spare as both obligation and display of respect. Even mundane meals followed unspoken rules, the best portions going to workers. Elders served first, hunger disguised when supplies were scarce. These customs reinforced community bonds through shared necessity. The perpetual cookpot symbolized medieval peasant resilience. Its contents might thin during hard times, but the fire beneath it rarely went out completely. Generation after generation sustained themselves through the same basic methods, making do, stretching supplies, finding nourishment where outsiders saw only scarcity. Modern nutritionists might critique the medieval Swiss diet's limitations, but its ingenious adaptations allowed survival in an environment that offered no guarantees. Each steaming bowl contained not just sustenance, but centuries of accumulated wisdom about enduring in the alpine heartland. The rustle of straw broke the silence before first light. In darkened homes across Swiss valleys, families awakened to another day of labor. No candles were lit yet, precious tallow saved for winter's longest nights. Men reached for wool tunics, stiff with yesterday's sweat, the fibers rough against sleep-warm skin. Women stirred the hearth's embers back to life, blowing gently until flames took hold. Their breath formed pale clouds in air still chilled from mountain night winds. Infants whimpered as mothers wrapped them tightly against the cold, their swaddling clothes smelling of wood smoke and milk. Older children dressed quickly, rubbing crusted sleep from their eyes. The morning routine left no time for lingering. The sun would soon crest the peaks, and daylight meant work. Hands groped in twilight for wooden bowls, as someone retrieved yesterday's bread from its hiding place, safe from mice. Breakfast was simple survival. Stale bread softened in weak beer, water being too dangerous to drink untreated. The beer's low alcohol content killed some bacteria, making it safer than untreated stream water. Each bite was chewed thoroughly, the coarse grind of peasant bread requiring effort to swallow. Families ate standing up or perched on stools, their movements precise in the cramped space. Some drank whey left from cheese-making, its sour tang cutting through the morning fog in their mouths. Outside, stars still pricked the dark sky when men gathered tools. Iron blades gleamed faintly as they lifted scythes onto shoulders. Leather harnesses creaked as oxen were yoked to wooden plows. The animals' breath steamed in the pre-dawn air as they shuffled impatiently. Already, distant clanging carried from other homesteads, neighbors beginning the same timeless rituals. Children as young as 6 took charge of goat herds, their small hands gripping crooked staffs. The animals balked at leaving their warm enclosure, winter coats still thick, despite spring's arrival. Persistent tugging and the occasional sharp tap moved them along. Goat bells clanked softly as the procession wound uphill, their hollow tones marking the children's progress toward summer pastures. By the time sunbeams first touched the highest meadows, scythes were already swinging in steady rhythm. Men cut hay in careful swaths, their movements honed through seasons of repetition. Blades needed frequent sharpening with smooth river stones, carried in leather pouches. Behind them followed women and older children, turning the cut grass to dry uniformly. Every third stroke of the scythe covered roughly a man's height, a pace maintained hour after hour, until backs screamed for relief. The steep alpine slopes dictated specialized tools. Plows here were lighter than those used on flat northern fields, their design accommodating angled terrain. Farmers walked alongside, rather than behind their oxen on precarious inclines. Terraces painstakingly built by generations past allowed narrow strips of tillable soil where barley and rye could grow. Each rocky outcrop had been tested by time, some useful for drying hay, others too unstable for safe passage when carrying heavy loads. Goat herds dispersed across slopes, too vertical for crops. Children monitored their charges while gathering whatever the land offered: early berries, edible greens, fallen branches for fuel. Their sharp eyes spotted useful plants their parents had taught them to recognize: nettle for soup, yarrow for wounds, sweet woodruff for flavoring beer. Small hands stripped pine needles to steep in hot water when winter coughs came. Nothing gathered was wasted, just as nothing grown or raised was squandered. The midday sun brought scant comfort at high elevations. Thin air robbed warmth even in summer, requiring layers rarely shed completely. Workers straightened stiff backs when the chapel bell rang across the valley, signaling the day's main meal. Hands wiped on coarse wool leggings before accepting wooden bowls of porridge or soup, carried up from village hearths. Eating happened where people worked, perched on stone walls or grassy hummocks. Fingers scooped thick gruel directly from shared bowls, the warmth welcomed despite the simple fare. Conversation stayed practical, discussing which field to cut next, which goat showing signs of illness, when rain might come. Brief rest followed, some napping in patches of shade, while others repaired tools or wove fresh grass into temporary ropes. Children's games mimicked adult labor, helping with pretend harvests or constructing miniature fences from twigs. Their laughter carried downslope, contrasting with the constant metallic ringing of cowbells from summer pastures. At this elevation, wildflowers bloomed in brief bursts of color between rock outcroppings, their nectar sustaining bees that villagers would later rob of precious honeycomb. Afternoon work varied by season, hoeing young crops in spring, haying through summer, harvesting grain come autumn. Some tasks required entire villages working cooperatively. Men and women formed lines to pass rocks when clearing new fields, their calloused hands indifferent to sharp edges. Physical contact happened constantly in this communal labor, a steadying hand on someone's back as they navigated a steep path, the brush of fingers when handing off tools. Teenagers performed the most strenuous tasks, digging drainage ditches, carrying stone for wall repairs, heaving full-grain sacks onto storage platforms. Their still-growing bodies lacked the wiry endurance of older workers, but their energy made them invaluable for short bursts of heavy labor. Elders directed activities from less taxing positions, their knowledge compensating for fading strength. Everyone found their place in the hierarchy of need and ability. As shadows lengthened, animals were gathered for the downhill trek. Goats resisted leaving tender browse, requiring children to nudge them persistently toward home paths. Cows waiting to be milked lowed impatiently in lower pastures. The procession back to the village moved slower than the morning's eager ascent, bodies weary from 12 or more hours of continuous labor. Torches flared to life around home compounds as daylight faded. Women had returned earlier to restart hearth fires and prepare the evening meal, often a thinner version of morning's porridge, with whatever scraps could be added. Men cooled blistered hands in buckets of spring water, while children rubbed salve onto the goats' cracked udders. The animals' welcoming bleats mingled with the clank of milking pails being set in place. Last tasks continued into darkness. Milking finished, cheese started, tools cleaned and stored. Families ate again by firelight, this meal quieter than breakfast's hurried routine. Teeth picked at stubborn bread crusts, while calloused feet soaked in warm water. The fire's glow revealed faces lined with dirt and fatigue, their stillness contrasting with the day's constant motion. Sleep came quickly on straw-filled mattresses, though rest was seldom uninterrupted. Infants needed feeding, animals occasionally startled awake, and in summer's hottest weeks, insects found their way through the open roof beams. Yet within moments of lying down, most adults succumbed to exhaustion, their bodies knowing full well the stars would reappear all too soon, signaling another pre-dawn awakening. Winter reversed these rhythms completely. Days began later, the sun's arc barely cresting the mountains before retreating. Indoor tasks replaced fieldwork, spinning wool, mending tools, carving essential household items. Still, darkness claimed most hours, leaving villagers huddled near their hearths for both warmth and the precious light of carefully rationed candles or oil lamps. Spring's return brought delirium of activity, fields to plow, seeds to sow, fences to repair after snowmelt. Suddenly, every hand was needed from first light until stars reappeared, bodies pushed to their limits before strength could be rebuilt from winter's meager diet. This seasonal whiplash repeated year after year, generation after generation, each family's survival balanced between summer's frantic abundance and winter's patient endurance. Church bells would eventually punctuate this endless cycle, their silver tones carrying across plowed fields and hay meadows alike. Faith intertwined with agricultural rhythms, saints' days marking optimal planting times, harvest festivals blending pagan gratitude with Christian ritual. Even during the busiest seasons, villagers paused when bells called them to prayer, however briefly. The sound carried reassurance, evidence that despite all uncertainties of weather and health, some constants remained unchanged. Season after season, the village bell's iron tongue sounded 3 times daily, at dawn, noon, and dusk, its metallic voice slicing through fieldwork and chores. When it rang, scythes were set down mid-swing, goats left untethered, and pots pulled from hearths. Families walked single file toward the whitewashed chapel, woolen clothes dusty from labor, and straw clinging to their leggings. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and beeswax candles that only the church could afford to burn freely. Latin liturgy rolled over the congregation like distant thunder, the words meaningless to most, but the rhythms familiar as seasons. People knelt on cold stone, their knees remembering the motions better than their minds understood the doctrine. While daily worship maintained routine, feast days fractured the agricultural calendar with bursts of respite. Christmas meant 12 days without fieldwork. Easter brought forbidden meats back to the table, and local saints' days paused village disputes. Processions wound through fields where priests blessed crops with sprinkles of holy water. The poorest families tasted luxuries reserved for holiness. Honeycomb drizzled on coarse bread, precious walnuts cracked open, dried apples resurrected in warm milk. These festivals blended Christian devotion with older rites, bonfires on midsummer hillsides, apples buried in autumn graves, evergreen boughs hung against winter spirits. Music lived most vibrantly during these holy celebrations. Village youths practiced pipe and drum in secret for weeks beforehand, their instruments carved from local woods during winter nights. Simple harmonies rose from voices unused to singing anything but work chants. Even the chapel's stern statues seemed to soften when candlelight flickered across their faces during midnight mass. After services, games and dancing spilled into churchyards, children chasing each other around gravestones, young women glancing sideways at potential suitors, elders clapping time from wooden benches. The liturgical calendar structured the entire year's labor. Plowing commenced after certain saints' days, hay cutting between others, grape harvesting timed to coincide with autumnal fasts. Even the bees' honey harvest followed church cycles, emptied on Assumption Day, after the insects had stored enough for winter survival. Villagers viewed deviations from these rhythms as tempting fate. Those who sowed too early risked frost. Those who harvested late risked mold and ruin. The church's ceremonies marked not just spiritual time, but agricultural necessity disguised as holy observance. Religious life permeated domestic spaces alongside church rituals. Homes kept saints' images painted on door beams or scratched into hearthstones. Mothers whispered charms over cradles that mingled Hail Marys with older protective rhymes. Travelers wore lead pilgrim badges sewn into their hats to ward off wolves and bandits. Even the village midwife carried a small silver cross to place on newborns' chests while cutting their umbilical cords. This blending of formal doctrine and folk belief created a practical faith rooted in daily survival rather than theological abstraction. The chapel itself served multiple purposes beyond worship. Its sturdy stone walls sheltered villagers during alpine storms when thatched roofs might blow away. The churchyard's linden tree provided summer shade for holding village courts and settling disputes. Important announcements echoed from the chapel steps after Mass. Tax collections, marriage bans, warnings of passing mercenary bands. During severe winters, the priest might allow starving families to harvest ivy from the church walls as emergency fodder for livestock. Sacred space bled into communal necessity at every turn. Pilgrimage offered rare opportunities to escape village confines. Some walked for days to reach regional shrines like Einsiedeln, where a Black Madonna supposedly worked miracles. These journeys blended devotion with practical benefits. Pilgrims carried local cheeses to trade at shrine towns, gathering news from distant valleys along the way. Youthful pilgrims might stretch the trip into weeks, working odd jobs for meals and sleeping in monastery guest houses. Homecomings became village events, with returning pilgrims sharing relics and tales of foreign wonders. Marble cathedrals, saintly bones that smelled of roses, holy springs that cured blindness. Death rituals demonstrated faith's tangible comforts. When villagers died, their bodies rested overnight in the chapel, surrounded by candles tended in shifts. Neighbors kept vigil to guard against restless spirits, passing the time reciting rosaries and sharing memories of the deceased. Gravediggers wrapped bodies in winding sheets, tied with 3 knots to prevent ghostly returns. Mourners placed ceramic bowls in fresh graves, practical sustenance for the afterlife's journey, rather than symbolic gestures. The dead weren't memorialized as much as carefully managed, their transition marked with equal parts grief and superstitious precaution. Saintly patronage influenced every vocation and village need. Blacksmiths invoked Eligius before forging plowshares. Shepherds prayed to Wendelin when wolves shadowed their flocks. Local healers knew which saints specialized in toothaches versus broken bones. Churches displayed relics according to their power. A finger bone might protect against hail, while a martyred nun's hair tamed unruly rivers. Alpine travelers made quick devotions before precarious crossings, touching the lead tokens around their necks as insurance against avalanches. Children absorbed this ritualized worldview early. They gathered herbs for Corpus Christi processions, where flowers carpeted the church path. Young girls learned to weave palm fronds into intricate crosses for Palm Sunday celebrations. Boys practiced ringing the church bell on minor feast days, their small arms barely able to pull the rope. Schooling happened through participation rather than instruction, observing fasts, attending baptisms, hearing miracle stories at winter firesides. By adolescence, they could recite the entire liturgical calendar with accompanying traditions, even if they couldn't read Latin scripture. Church authorities wielded surprising flexibility in rural areas distant from episcopal oversight. Priests often overlooked folk customs contradicting doctrine, as long as basic sacraments were observed. They might bless fields using pagan-style processions, or tolerate love charms incorporating saints' names. This practical compromise maintained the church's authority while allowing ancient mountain traditions to persist in adapted forms. Only flagrant heresies provoked intervention. Most village priests recognized that alpine survival required flexible holiness. The Reformation arrived slowly in Swiss valleys, filtered through geographic isolation and local skepticism. Some villages split bitterly between old and new faiths, their chapels alternating between Latin Mass and German sermons. Others ignored theological debates entirely, continuing traditional practices regardless of official doctrine. Mountain communities often cared more about whether a priest could protect their crops from hail than whether he believed in transubstantiation. Faith remained tangible, something that filled bellies as well as souls, warding off both damnation and early frosts. Sacred time intersected with earthly survival at every turn. Church bells synchronized human labor with celestial patterns. Feast days relieved relentless toil. Pilgrimage routes doubled as trade networks. Even the chapel's architecture reflected alpine practicality, its thick walls withstanding avalanches, its tower serving as both bell cote and watchtower. When villagers prayed for deliverance from plague or famine, they did so knowing divinity worked through tangible means, through medicinal herbs springing up near shrines, through favorable winds drying hay at critical moments, through the endurance of their own hands guided by generations of watchful saints. Before dawn on market days, men checked each goat's hooves for cracks, running calloused fingers along the horned ridges. They packed carefully, rounds of hard cheese wrapped in damp cloth to prevent drying, iron tools bundled with straw to prevent clanging. Each animal carried no more than 30 pounds, the weight distributed evenly in wooden panniers, lashed with willow withes. Goats were preferred over mules for these narrow tracks. Their agility on scree slopes offset the slower pace. The chosen path followed ancient animal trails across crumbling cliffs. Some sections were barely a yard wide, with nothing but air beyond the edge. Travelers walked single file, each man watching the goat ahead, while keeping one hand against the rock wall. Loose stones clattered into the void at every step, their echoes fading into the valley below. Experienced traders knew never to look down when crossing exposed sections. One glance at the 300-foot drop could freeze even sure-footed goats. Weather changed swiftly in the passes. Morning frost might give way to midday sun that softened goat hoof grip on rocks, then afternoon storms that turned dirt into slick mud. Men carried rolled wool cloaks to throw over precipice edges when hail fell marble-sized and stinging. Crossing during early spring meant navigating lingering snow patches, where a misstep could send both goat and cargo sliding helplessly downward. Autumn trips risked early blizzards that obscured the trail markers, small stone cairns piled shoulder high, where the path curved unexpectedly. At noon, they rested where the trail widened slightly, tethering goats to iron rings, hammered into the rock centuries earlier. Each man ate a wedge of cheese from his own stores, saving the harder outer rind for evening. Water came from leather bottles stoppered with wood. Streams were plentiful, but often carried runoff from distant pastures that could sicken drinkers. Conversation stayed practical. Which sections needed careful footing, which goats were tiring, whether the salt traders from the south had been spotted yet at the pass. The trading summit materialized abruptly, a flat expanse of rock, where trails from 3 valleys intersected. Here, Swiss Highlanders met Italian merchants who'd climbed from southern valleys with sacks of fine white salt. Business commenced without shared language. Fingers indicated numbers, nods sealed agreements. A 2-pound round of aged Alp cheese might fetch half that weight in salt. Iron implements traded higher. A good scythe blade could bring 3 measures of salt, plus a handful of southern raisins, if the buyer was eager. Dangers accumulated on the return trip, weary men and animals moving slower on descent. Goats tended to rush downward unless held firmly by their lead ropes, risking broken legs on uneven ground. Late afternoon shadows made depth perception treacherous. What appeared solid footing might actually be a gap between rocks. Some stretches required walking backward while guiding goats carefully down stone steps, worn smooth by generations of traffic. Occasionally, a trader never returned home. Perhaps a goat slipped on wet rock, dragging its handler into the abyss. Maybe snow obscured the trail until cold, and exhaustion overcame a solitary traveler. Some fell prey to bandits who haunted certain passes. Though most robbers avoided killing, dead men couldn't bring more goods next season. Back in the village, families waited through extra nights before accepting loss, then divided the missing man's responsibilities among his kin. Winter storms sometimes revealed tragedies come spring. A frozen corpse curled beside a dead goat mid-trail, or a scattered load of iron tools gleaming beneath melted snow. These discoveries prompted brief memorials before the pragmatic reuse of any salvageable goods. The cheese would be long spoiled, but iron was forever. Equipment failures could prove as deadly as falls. A frayed rope snapping at the wrong moment sent panniers bouncing down cliffsides. Rough trails wore through boot leather in a single season, leaving feet vulnerable to sharp rocks. Metal crampons for icy sections required constant repair. A broken spike could mean losing traction at critical moments. Traders carried simple repair kits: strips of leather, lumps of beeswax for waterproofing, iron rivets, and a small hammer for emergency fixes. Bandits weren't the only human threat. Customs officials from valley lords sometimes demanded tolls at strategic points, their armed guards making refusal impossible. More problematic were mercenary bands wandering between wars. Hungry soldiers cared little for the long-term damage of stealing an entire season's cheese haul. Some traders carried hidden pouches of lesser cheese to surrender, while keeping prime rounds sewn into their clothing. Animal predators stalked the trails too. Wolves rarely attacked groups, but could pick off stragglers. Snow leopards were legendarily shy, yet left unmistakable tracks across high passes. More dangerous were the domesticated mastiffs some traders brought as guards. Poorly trained dogs might startle goats off cliffs in their enthusiasm. Navigation relied entirely on memory and subtle landmarks. No maps existed for these routes. Each trader learned the path by accompanying elders as a boy. Distinctive rock formations served as turning points. The broken tooth pinnacle, the singing stone that echoed in certain winds, the widow's face, cliffside, that looked mournful in afternoon light. Missing one marker could mean hours lost on dead-end spurs, where turning a loaded goat required precarious maneuvers. Night travel was avoided except in emergencies. Those caught out after dark built rough rock shelters and huddled with goats for warmth, rather than risk unseen precipices. Moonlight could deceive by flattening perspective. Many accidents happened during bright nights, when overconfident travelers pushed too far. dawn often revealed how close they'd come to disaster, with yesterday's footprints ending abruptly at drop-offs invisible in darkness. Some traders adopted superstitious rituals for safe passage, a particular pebble carried in the pocket, a prayer muttered at certain bends, or refusing to speak the names of dangerous spots aloud. These practices weren't true religion, but practical psychology, something to focus attention during monotonous hours of careful stepping. Even skeptical traders might finger a lucky charm when crossing particularly treacherous sections. The economics of these trips barely justified the risks. A full day's walk each way for perhaps 40 pounds of salt doesn't suggest wealth. But in valleys where every cow's lactation cycle mattered, where iron deposits were scarce, where a single bad harvest could mean starvation, these exchanges meant survival. Children grew taller when food was seasoned properly. Wounds healed cleaner when tools were sharp, and elders lived longer when winter meals had flavor beyond bare sustenance. For those waiting in the village, market days brought their own tensions. Wives listened for goat bells while preparing extra food, knowing men would return hungry. Children were kept from troublesome play that might distract from listening for returning footsteps. The whole village could tell when someone wasn't coming back. The way a family stopped glancing toward the trail. How goats were redistributed to other households without discussion. Gravity was the most relentless foe. Whether dragging sledges uphill or controlling descents, every movement required calculating weight distribution. Goats were bred for balance, but even they could topple if loads shifted unexpectedly. Traders developed distinctive gaits, short steps, slightly crouched, always ready to drop and grab the stony ground if footing failed. Some routes included sections where men had carved handholds into cliffsides centuries earlier, their placement tested by generations of grasping fingers. Those who survived decades of these trips bore physical proof. Crooked fingers from old breaks, knees that predicted storms, deep squint lines from years of sun glare on snow. Their knowledge became communal property as they trained younger men, pointing out which switchbacks had collapsed since last spring, where an overhang shook dangerously during thunderstorms, which gullies filled suddenly during rains. The trade continues today along some routes, though now with aluminum crampons and LED headlamps. The cheeses and goods have changed, but not the essential rhythm. Careful steps, balanced loads, and the understanding that mountains demand respect with every passing season. What modern hikers consider wilderness trails were once essential lifelines, each scrape of goat hoof on rock representing another month of survival for families waiting in isolated valleys below. Those vanished traders left no grand monuments, just occasional rusted crampons wedged in crevices, and the persistent memory of necessity that drove ordinary men to walk literal edges for the sake of salt and iron. Their legacy hides in plain sight. The enduring Swiss reputation for precision and persistence, forged quite literally on these knife-edged paths between impossible slopes. Childbirth always came to the single-room home, never to hospitals or separate chambers. When labor pains began, the mother's female relatives took charge immediately. They sent children to fetch the village midwife if one existed, or relied on experienced elder women when no specialist was available. The midwife arrived with her cloth bundle of tools, a sharp knife for cutting the cord, linen strips for binding, dried herbs for pain or bleeding. The mother labored near the hearth where warmth and boiling water were close at hand. She gripped a stout rope hung from the ceiling beam, its fibers worn smooth by generations of grasping hands. The rope allowed her to squat during contractions while maintaining balance, the preferred birthing position for easier delivery. Other women supported her under the arms or pressed warm cloths against her back. The room smelled of sweat and the rosemary steam boiling in a pot nearby. No men participated, except when complications demanded extraordinary measures. Fathers waited outside with the other village males, tending animals or pretending normality until summoned. Inside, female whispers mixed with the mother's groans and the fire's crackle. Older girls observed silently, absorbing knowledge they'd someday need. The midwife checked progress with her fingers, speaking encouragements or issuing sharp commands as needed. When the baby crowned, the midwife guided its emergence with steady hands. Strong contractions might deliver the child swiftly. Weaker ones required patience and repositioning. The cord was cut with the ritual knife, its blade wiped clean first with vinegar if available. The newborn's cry brought relieved sighs, unless it failed to come. Then the midwife would rub the tiny chest with salt, or blow sharply into the mouth, until life declared itself. Post-birth rituals followed precise tradition. The placenta was carefully buried near the hearth. This organ connecting mother and child held mystical significance that demanded proper treatment. Some families mixed the burial with grains to ensure future fertility. Others whispered protective spells as soil covered the spot. The newborn was washed in warm water containing protective herbs, then swaddled tightly in strips of linen that restricted movement for the first months. Mothers faced up to a month of enforced recovery called the lying-in period. Neighbors and relatives rotated bringing meals, hearty broths, with marrow bones to restore strength, special cheeses believed to increase milk production. The mother remained mostly in bed near the fire, nursing when the infant demanded while others managed household chores. This collective care system reflected the village's understanding that maternal health directly impacted the child's survival odds. Complications tested the community's medical knowledge. Excessive bleeding after birth might be treated with powdered yarrow or spider webs pressed into the wound. Emergency measures that sometimes stemmed the flow. Fever required cooling compresses and willow bark tea, while someone rushed to fetch the priest for last rites. Birth injuries like tearing were stitched with boiled thread, if the midwife had that skill, or packed with moss as a primitive dressing if not. Child mortality shadowed every birth. Perhaps 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday, from infections, birth defects, or simple failure to thrive. Mothers grieved quietly while continuing to nurse surviving siblings. The household couldn't pause for mourning when survival demanded constant labor. Lost infants were buried swiftly near the house, sometimes with small toys or carved saint medallions to comfort their souls. Women who couldn't produce milk faced desperate choices. Wealthier families might hire a wet nurse, often a younger mother whose own child had died. Others fed babies diluted goat milk through cloth teats, knowing the survival odds were poor. Some resorted to pre-chewed gruel, passed mouth to mouth, a risky practice that often introduced deadly infections. The line between nourishment and poisoning was narrow in these improvised feedings. Birth intervals averaged 2 years, the time needed for a mother's body to recover and a toddler to become somewhat self-sufficient. Nursing suppressed fertility to some degree, though not reliably. Families used various traditional methods to space children: withdrawal, certain herbal preparations, or simple abstinence during perceived fertile periods. Still, most women bore 8 to 12 children in their lifetimes, knowing half might die before adulthood. Midwives carried reputations that far exceeded their medical knowledge. Some were celebrated as near magical healers. Others feared as possible witches when outcomes were poor. Their techniques mixed practical experience with folk beliefs, boiling tools for cleanliness, while also reciting protective rhymes. A successful midwife might inherit small gifts from grateful families, an extra egg here, a length of cloth there, but mostly earned respect rather than wealth. Men's roles in childbirth were strictly limited, but economically crucial. The father owed protection and provision during the vulnerable lying-in period, sometimes taking on women's tasks, like milking or cooking. His social standing affected what resources the family could call upon. Poorer fathers might struggle to secure extra food or firewood for a recovering wife. The birth of a healthy son strengthened a man's village status, while inability to produce heirs could prompt quiet speculation about divine disfavor. Multiple births brought both celebration and anxiety. Twins stressed finite maternal resources, though some villages viewed them as lucky. Triplets often meant choosing which infants to prioritize, a heartbreaking calculus made through whispered consultations midwives never discussed afterwards. Defective births, those with obvious deformities, were sometimes quietly left for the angels in remote spots, though records of this practice are understandably scarce. Breastfeeding continued for 2 or 3 years when possible, providing nutrition and natural birth spacing. Weaning happened abruptly when the next pregnancy began, with toddlers shifted to adult foods without ceremony. Some children thrived on the peasant diet of grains and dairy. Others wasted away from intestinal ailments, aggravated by coarse fare. Those who survived to age 5 stood reasonable chances of reaching adulthood barring epidemics or accidents. Knowledge of childbirth passed through hands rather than books. Girls learned by assisting, holding bowls of water, folding clean linens, watching how women supported laboring mothers. Midwives took promising apprentices under their guidance, teaching them to distinguish normal pain from distress signals. This oral tradition preserved techniques that occasionally defied later medical understanding, like keeping newborns warm before washing them, or recognizing when breech births could proceed naturally. Postpartum depression lacked a name, but was recognized as a real phenomenon. Women who seemed listless or disinterested in their newborns were watched carefully, lest they neglect the child's feeding. Sometimes the husband's sister or mother would essentially foster the infant temporarily, while the biological mother recovered mentally. Severe cases might prompt a priest's intervention with prayers or light penances, thought to restore emotional balance. Stillbirths and miscarriages occurred frequently enough to have established rituals. Tiny bodies were wrapped in clean cloth and buried quickly, often near the house foundation, where their spirits could continue guarding the family. Mothers were encouraged to name these losses for mourning purposes, even when the child hadn't drawn breath. Some households kept small wooden memorials tucked near the hearth, crude carvings representing lost infants not entered in the parish records. Transporting gravely ill mothers was rarely attempted. Moving someone hemorrhaging or feverish along mountain trails meant almost certain death. Villages relied instead on whatever wisdom their midwives possessed. Knowledge that might include effective herbal remedies, alongside questionable practices like bleeding or applying dung poultices. The line between medicine and magic blurred in these crises, where outcomes depended more on luck than skill. Winter births posed particular challenges. Keeping newborns warm required constant fire maintenance, even as fuel supplies dwindled. Mothers recovering in cold homes risked lung infections from chills. Some villages maintained a communal birth house, kept moderately warm for winter deliveries, often just a slightly larger cottage with an extra hearth. The season's isolation meant fewer neighbors available to help if complications arose before spring trails reopened. Records suggest medieval Swiss women faced childbirth with pragmatic fatalism. Prayer helped, but wouldn't alter anatomy. Preparation mattered, but couldn't prevent all complications. Community support sustained families through losses and successes alike. Each healthy baby represented another pair of hands for future labors, another voice to carry on family traditions, another link in the chain of alpine survival, stretching back through generations. For all its dangers, childbirth also reinforced communal bonds. Women who'd assisted each other's deliveries shared unspoken understandings that lasted lifetimes. Men who'd fetched the midwife through blizzards or butchered their last chicken for a neighbor's postpartum soup earned enduring loyalty. Even children remembered who helped their mothers during vulnerable times. These memories shaped future marriages, business dealings, and alliances in a world where no family could thrive alone. Modern medicine has transformed, but not eliminated birth's uncertainties. Contemporary Swiss maternity wards still see emergencies requiring swift intervention, just as medieval midwives faced sudden hemorrhages. The essential drama remains: new life emerging through pain and risk, the fragile moments when existence hangs between generations, the universal relief when a baby's cry pierces the tense silence. Our equipment has changed beyond recognition, but not the fundamental miracle witnessed in homes humble and grand throughout human history. What medieval peasants lacked in medical knowledge, they compensated for in attentive care. Midwives stayed with laboring women for hours without breaks, recognizing subtle changes modern monitors might miss. Families adapted homes temporarily around birth's needs, moving livestock, creating makeshift privacy screens, adjusting sleeping arrangements. The whole village became invested in each successful delivery, for every healthy child meant future security for all. The hunger winters came without warning. A late snowfall might blanket newly sprouted crops in May. A summer hailstorm could strip fields bare in minutes. When grain stores dwindled too early, families faced choices no one should have to make. First, they stretched what remained. Bread made from coarse barley, mixed with ground acorns or dried peas. Gruel thickened with whatever greenery hadn't frozen: nettles, moss, even boiled tree bark. The broth turned foul, but starvation dulled the taste. Milk production dropped as cows gnawed on straw bedding instead of fresh grass. Cheese reserves meant for winter vanished by autumn. Each day tightened the knot in empty stomachs. Old people died first. Grandparents quietly refused portions meant for children and working men. Their bodies already weakened by decades of labor succumbed quickly to cold and hunger. Mothers thinned their own milk, passing less to nursing infants. Newborns faded into silence before their first cries had fully warmed the house. The weakest lasted weeks without solid food, then slipped away in their sleep. Midwinter was the cruelest. Frozen rivers blocked water sources. Snowdrifts sealed doors shut until someone tunneled out. Families clustered around hearths that burned low for lack of timber, their breath steaming faintly in air, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Illness spread as cramped quarters weakened immune systems. A simple cough turned to lung fever. A scraped knee festered without proper food to heal it. Some winters left entire households frozen together when supplies ran out. Spring melt revealed them curled against one another, faces pressed into wool cloaks, for warmth they never found. Neighbors digging through collapsed roofs might discover a father still clutching his last wedge of moldy cheese, left uneaten for smaller hands that stopped needing it days earlier. Bones were buried quickly when the ground thawed, too many for individual graves. Children learned hunger's stages early. First came the sharp pangs, then the hollow ache, then the numbness where stomachs seemed to forget they existed. They watched adults portion food with silent calculations, who could skip a meal without collapsing, who needed just enough to keep working. Some stole mouthfuls when no one was looking. Older siblings pretended not to notice. The Alps magnified these crises. Unlike lowland villages near rivers teeming with fish or forests full of game, mountain communities lived on knife-edge sustainability. Steep terrain limited farmland. Long winters required perfect harvest calculations. Too little stored grain meant catastrophe before spring. Goat herds that survived mild winters collapsed under deep snow. Trade routes froze shut, cutting off salt and iron needed for preservation and tools. Yet even in deprivation, small mercies appeared. Some villages maintained emergency grain pits, their locations known only to elders, until desperate times arrived. Abbots occasionally unlocked monastery stores, though church tithes had often skimmed those same reserves earlier. Hunters risked avalanches to track weakened deer floundering in snow. Those who found meat shared it thinly but universally. Even a single hair could flavor broth for an entire household. Superstition intertwined with survival. Certain herbs were hung over doors to ward off famine spirits. Elders told stories of past winters survived through stubbornness alone. Breadcrumbs were scattered for invisible beggars, ghosts who might bring fortune if appeased. Some whispered that eating St. John's wort kept starvation at bay, though nothing truly filled shrunken stomachs except more food. Desperation drove some to extremes. Fern roots dug from frozen earth could stave off death if boiled long enough, though they left mouths numb for days. Leather straps were simmered into barely edible jelly. Stories persisted of families eating their hunting dogs before surrendering to hunger, an act spoken of only in hushed tones afterward. Such measures marked the line between survival and something darker few wished to name. Neighboring valleys developed elaborate warning systems. Smoke signals from one hillside settlement might alert others to scarce supplies. Boys ran messages along perilous ridges when starvation threatened multiple villages. Distant relatives took in orphaned children if they had food to spare. If not, they sent them back with whatever scraps could be carried. The church offered limited refuge. Monasteries sometimes fed the starving in exchange for labor, breaking stones, weaving baskets, or chopping what little wood remained. Priests performed mass burials when gravediggers lacked strength to pierce frozen earth. Prayers for mercy echoed beside empty granaries. Many wondered why God allowed such suffering, but few voiced doubts aloud when faith was all they had left. Spring's arrival carried both relief and dread. Snowmelt revealed dead livestock, spoiled stores, and lost tools. Fields that should have been plowed weeks ago lay untended. Survivors counted who was left to plant. Widows and orphans attached themselves to larger households through informal adoptions. The strongest began clearing debris. The weakened collapsed from exertion. Every hand mattered now. Somehow, through the worst winters, songs still returned with summer. Women humming as they scrubbed winter's grime from cottages. Herders whistling to flocks released onto fresh grass. Children's laughter. Fewer voices than last year, but still alive. Festivals were quieter, meals smaller, but the mountain villages endured. The alpine lifestyle demanded this resilience. Unlike plains, farmers who could relocate after bad harvests, mountain peasants had nowhere to go but down, into valleys already overcrowded or foreign lands where they weren't welcome. Their ancestors had chosen this hard existence centuries earlier, trading easy fertility for defensive isolation. Each famine etched itself into collective memory, hardening traditions that minimized future risks. Communalism became essential. Villagers who hoarded food during shortages found themselves excluded from future help. Those who shared despite their own hunger earned lifelong loyalty. Systems of reciprocity developed. A sack of grain lent one winter might be repaid decades later when fortunes reversed. These unwritten contracts bound communities tighter than any law. The hunger winters shaped Switzerland's character in ways still visible today. Pragmatic resourcefulness, suspicion of over-reliance on outsiders, a deep-seated preference for preparedness. Modern Swiss pantries remain stocked, cellar shelves laden with preserves, echoes of ancestral instincts carved by starvation's knife. Mountain folk learned that survival wasn't guaranteed, no matter how carefully one planned. Yet equally important was the lesson that deprivation didn't erase humanity. Eldest tradition insists that even at the worst moments, some still shared their last crust. Strangers were fed before being questioned. Frozen bodies were buried with the same dignity as those lost in plenty. The starving sang, not because they had hope, but because silence was surrender. Modern nutrition charts would label their diet woefully deficient. Yet these people survived conditions that would kill many today. Their bodies adapted to cycles of scarcity and abundance, unknown in industrialized societies. Bones grew denser, despite calcium shortages. Digestive systems maximized every calorie. Their resilience was physiological, as much as psychological. The hunger winters never fully disappeared from alpine memory. Each generation passed down warnings. Don't waste. Store extra. Remember 1438. The dates varied by valley, but the message remained. Survive today. Prepare for tomorrow. Modern historians struggle to quantify how many perished in these crises. Parish records omit the worst years. Mass graves leave no names. Perhaps the most telling legacy is how Switzerland treats hunger today. Surplus food distribution systems trace lineage to medieval grain-sharing pacts. Foreign aid programs mirror old alpine aid networks scaled globally. The same villages that once starved now store emergency reserves for less prepared nations. If you hike Swiss trails today, you might spot crumbling stone cottons abandoned centuries ago, when hunger finally drove inhabitants out. Look closer, and you'll see their gardens, still growing wild apple trees planted for winter cider, hardy herbs that once flavored desperate meals. Berry bushes tended long after the hands that loved them turned to dust. The land remembers even when history books don't. Survival left scars on national consciousness. Swiss neutrality wasn't just political strategy. It was born from knowing that war meant starvation when mountain trade routes closed. Federalism reflected hard lessons about distributing limited resources fairly. Even the famous Swiss work ethic traces back to generations who knew idle hands meant empty larders when snow fell. Yet for all the suffering, one truth emerged. Hunger winters always ended. The sun returned. Snow melted. Frozen seeds sprouted. Children born in scarcity grew tall when better years arrived. The Alps gave no guarantees, but they never refused those stubborn enough to endure. Tonight, when you sit down to a meal, pause for those who didn't. Somewhere in Swiss valleys, winds still carry whispers of winters survived. Faint but unbroken, like an old woman humming as she stirs her pot, determined that this winter, at least, will not be the hungry one. The firelight grows dim now, children. These quiet stories of Swiss peasants, their single-room homes and perilous mountain paths, their simmering pots and hunger winters, were not just survival, but the forging of a people. Every cheese traded on cliffs, every handful of grain shared in famine, every hymn sung in dark chapels laid stones for modern Switzerland. Their endurance shaped our stubborn independence, our careful preparedness, our understanding that communities survive what individuals cannot. Let these ancestors rest in your memory, as they did in their smoky beds, worn by labor, but unbroken. Sleep, and may their resilience linger in your dreams like wood smoke in wool.